Good morning, everybody. It's my great pleasure to open this webinar, multi-stakeholder information webinar on Darwin EU. I would like to start by welcoming you on behalf of the EMA, but also on behalf of the European Regulatory Network to this really important milestone in our transition to data-driven regulation. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. The meeting is being broadcast live on the EMA website and will be recorded. Your microphones as attendees are muted. I will repeat instructions for the Q&A session when we get to the Q&A session, but just to identify already the Slido, you'll see the QR code on the screen. You can also get there by going to slido.com and using hashtag DarwinEU without a gap between Darwin and EU. The Slido is active now and questions can already be submitted, but you might like to hear the presentations before you start putting questions in, because I suspect many of your questions will be answered in the presentations, both from EMA and from the Darwin EU Coordination Centre. Interaction with Slido is voluntary, and we have sent you a privacy statement relating to how the data will be used that you submit. Speakers and panelists should unmute themselves when speaking and then remute themselves afterwards. And if you have any technical difficulties, then you can send an email to virtualmeetings@EMA. It's the standard EMA email address, virtual meetings, all as one word. So if I can just introduce the agenda. In a few moments, I'm going to hand over to Emma Cook and then Carl Breuskal to introduce the webinar. We then have Xavier Kurtz, who's the EMA Senior Pharmacoepidemiologist, who will introduce the Darwin EU network. Jean-Marie Candore, Senior Statistician at the agency, will then elaborate on some of the use cases for real-world evidence that can be delivered through Darwin. And then we're very pleased to be joined by Professor Peter Reinbeck from the Darwin EU Coordination Centre, who will give some orientations on how the Darwin Coordination Centre will be set up, the initial steps, and so on. And then we will close with a short presentation from André Cedric. André Cedric is the project manager for the establishment of Darwin EU on EMA's behalf, and he will talk about an outlook for 2022. So that's our schedule for the next hour and a half. So it's with great pleasure then that I introduce Emma Cook, Executive Director of the European Medicines Agency, to formally open our webinar. Emma, please.
Thank you, Peter. And indeed, I am really delighted as both Executive Director of EMA and Co-Chair of the Darwin EU Advisory Board to open today's Darwin EU information webinar. And this webinar marks an important milestone in advancing integration of real-world evidence into medicines assessment, and I would like to thank you all for participation. One of the reasons we're here today is linked to EMA's new extended mandate, because this extended mandate explicitly sets the stage for investing and leveraging real-world evidence and responses to support crisis preparedness and response. On 1st of February this year, the regulation on a reinforced role for EMA in crisis preparedness and management for medicinal products and medical devices entered into force. And although the majority of this regulation will become applicable on the 1st of March 2022, we prepared a number of procedures and initiatives to help enable a speedy implementation of the regulation. So speaking about preparedness, the kickoff of Darwin's establishment phase with the appointment of the Coordination Centre followed almost immediately after the publication of the mandate and indeed ahead of the date of the application. As I mentioned, investing in and leveraging real-world evidence to support crisis preparedness and response is one of the key elements for EMA's work under this mandate. And this includes the establishment of a pan-European network of real-world data, which we call Darwin EU. Darwin EU will provide EMA's scientific committees with real-world evidence from healthcare databases across the EU, and it will be central to prepare for and respond to future public health crises such as COVID-19. So what could be more timely? The vision of Darwin EU is to give EMA and national competent authorities access to valid and trustworthy real-world evidence, for example, on diseases, patient populations, and the use, safe and effectiveness of medicines, including vaccines, throughout the life cycle of a medicinal product. By supporting decision-making on the development, authorization and surveillance of medicines, a wide range of stakeholders will benefit, from patients and healthcare professionals to health technology assessment bodies and, of course, the pharmaceutical industry. Darwin EU will act as a pathfinder for the European health data space and will ultimately connect to the European health services, enabling the use of this data in the context of medicines regulation in Europe. EMA will be working with the Erasmus University Medical Centre Rotterdam to establish the Darwin EU Coordination Centre, and you will hear a lot more about this today, because the Coordination Centre is designed to develop and manage a network of real-world healthcare data across the EU and will be able to conduct scientific studies requested by medicines regulators and at a later stage requested by other stakeholders. The contract was awarded following an open call for tender, and we're delighted to have Erasmus Medical Centre as the contractor because the medical centre is highly experienced in database management, in federated analysis and multi-database studies, as well as being in a position to use a common data model, and which means that this can be readily available to a large number of potential data partners. We will work collaboratively to ensure that Darwin EU rapidly delivers benefits, and we will pilot regulatory use cases across the life cycle of medicines. Let me give you an example of some of these use cases. We see that use cases from disease epidemiology can support decisions on the development of products. Use cases on the safety of products on the market will contribute to more rapid and robust evaluation of safety signals. The outcome of these studies will bring benefits across many stakeholders groups. They will support industry research, they will support health technology assessment and payer decisions, but ultimately they will facilitate access for medicines to new and optimally used products. So I'd like to thank you all for participating today in this webinar. I'm counting on your active engagement, and I wish you a very successful meeting.
Thank you very much, Emma. Indeed, the timing is impressive in terms of the new mandate starting to operate in March and the appointment of the Coordination Centre and kicking off this transformational work on finding a place and optimizing the use of real-world evidence. Moving then straight to Professor Karl Breuskal, as everybody will know, is president of BfArM. He also chairs the HMA Management Group, and importantly is the co-chair with Emma of the Darwin EU Advisory Board. So Karl, it's a great pleasure to hear some opening remarks, please.
Yeah, thanks, Peter and Emma. A warm welcome to this webinar today from my side as well. It's a pleasure for me to participate in this multi-stakeholder webinar today on Darwin EU and to contribute to this important topic on the use of real-world evidence in the regulatory decision-making with some opening remarks. So what is our vision in the network? The European Medicines Regulatory Network has a strategy to 2025 for better medicines regulation in support of public health and particularly innovation. At the core of this strategy is investing in digitalization and data transformation and harnessing real-world evidence for better regulatory decision-making is a top priority for our network. You all know, as regulators for a long time, we have been reluctant to accept real-world data, and some colleagues from evidence-based medicine approaches are still skeptical. But Emer already mentioned several use cases, and we have seen in the pandemic situation with use of the vaccines, perfect use cases how real-world evidence can help us in our decision-making. Therefore, the network's approach places real-world evidence in the wider context of big data and is guided by the priority recommendations of our big data task force. These recommendations are being implemented through the Big Data Steering Group, and the second multi-annual work plan was published in August 2021, which is followed now by HMA and EMA. The work plan with its 11 work streams delivers our network vision for a regulatory system that is able to integrate big data into its assessment and decision-making, so that we can support the development of innovative medicines, deliver life-saving treatments to patients more quickly, and optimize the safe and effective use of medicines as outlined by Emer already. Our aim is that by 2025, the use of real-world evidence will have been enabled and the value will have been established across the spectrum of all regulatory use cases. Darwin EU is the first deliverable of the Big Data Steering Group work plan and key feature of the regulatory network strategy to 2025. The creation of Darwin plays a major role to enable our vision. So some national medicines agencies and EMA have been investing in access to real-world data earlier. Building on this experience, in early 2021, the network initiated plans to create an EU-wide distributed network of real-world data, the Darwin EU. I'm very pleased that this plan is now becoming a reality. The establishment of the Coordination Center for Darwin EU is a big step forward. Darwin EU will greatly contribute to the EU priorities on enabling real-world evidence use and establishing its value for regulatory decision-making. We will be working to deliver on both priorities through a collaborative approach where we leverage the best that different stakeholders can bring, and where those stakeholders can complement the central role of industry in generating evidence and in turn support the development and use of better medicines for patients. That's the goal overall. So thank you for participating in this event today and supporting our vision for the use of real-world evidence in our regulatory medicines decision-making. I wish you an informative meeting and success with your discussion. So thank you very much again, and back to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Carl. Thank you very much indeed for the ongoing support and the leadership on data within the network and also at the Darwin EU Advisory Board. So, colleagues, I'm very pleased now to move on to the subject, the content of the day, and Xavier Kurtz, head of the Data Analytics Workstream at the European Medicines Agency and the agency's senior pharmacoepidemiologist, is going to give an overview of Darwin EU. So over to you, Xavier, please.
Good morning. So I'm Xavier Kurtz, and I will introduce the data analysis and real-world evidence network, which is called Darwin EU. You know it now. And in my introduction, I will explain why Darwin EU has been put in place and what are the main components of this network. Now the next slide. Darwin EU is an important element of the strategy to 2025 established by the European Medicines Regulatory Network. And this strategy says that by 2025, the use of real-world evidence will have been enabled and its value will have been established across the spectrum of regulatory use cases. Furthermore, use of real-world evidence requires access to and analysis of real-world data. But what do we mean by real-world evidence and real-world data? We define real-world data as routinely collected data relating to patients' health status or the delivery of healthcare from a variety of sources other than clinical trials. And there is a very large variety of data sources. Currently, the data sources that are most easily accessed by regulators concern those containing data on electronic health care records from ambulatory care or specialist care, hospital data, registries, claims data, or mobile health. But the situation is progressively changing. For example, genetic data may not be available from biobanks like the biobank existing in Estonia. Then real-world evidence is defined as information derived from the analysis of real-world data, but it should be stressed that this is not any information. This is high-quality information that is relevant, valid, reliable, and appropriate for regulatory decision-making. So what do we need to increase the generation and use of real-world evidence? There are two sides of the coin, the demand side and the supply side. On the demand side, and this is on the right, the need for real-world evidence will come, at least in the first stage, from the EMA and MEA scientific committees, and the main ones are listed here. It will also come from regulatory national competent authorities and from other organizations like the European Commission's health technology assessment bodies, payers, and other EU health agencies. On the supply side, we need data, and therefore we need to identify which relevant data sources are available, and we need to assess the quality and adequacy of the data that they contain. We need also skills, methodologies, and techniques to assess the data, and the Darwini Eu Coordination Center will provide the skills. We then need an organization, processes, and governance, and we are developing these in parallel to the establishment of the Darwini Eu Coordination Center. I now arrive to the description of the Darwini Eu network. Darwini Eu is a federated network of data, expertise, and services that supports better decision-making throughout the product lifecycle by generating reliable evidence from real-world healthcare data. By federated network, we mean a network of data sources where the data stay locally and a common data model is used to perform studies in a timely manner and to increase the consistency of results. The concept of a common data model will be described extensively later in the webinar. Who are the actors of Darwini Eu? Darwini Eu will be operated by the Coordination Center, and the Coordination Center will interact with different organizations. First of all, EMA, who will have an oversight on the activities of the Coordination Center and will interact with the scientific committees to identify research questions and provide results. The Coordination Center will also liaise with the European health data space and will interact with the data permit authorities established in the member states to support the access to data source available in their country. The Coordination Center will, of course, direct indirectly with the data partners that will be onboarded in the federated network of data. Now, I said that Darwini Eu will provide data, services, and expertise, but in practice, what does it mean? And this is on the next slide. The Darwini Eu will provide scientific expertise in formulating and executing studies and analysis. It will maintain a catalog of known relevant data orders, continually ensuring the discoverability and quality of data held by the data holders. And then it will maintain and expand the federated network of data partners assisting the new data holders in becoming data partners by conforming to required standards for usage in the regulatory context. Darwini Eu will conduct scientific studies and analysis on behalf of the network and the EMA scientific committees. It will deliver training, governance, and support the business services and it will enable the regulatory network, EMEA, and the scientific committees to make use of the European health data space in the context of medicine regulation. And then Darwin EU will act as a EHDS pathfinder. What analysis and studies will Darwin EU deliver? And we have classified this type of analysis and studies in 4 categories. The first one are the routine repeated analysis. These are analyses that based on a generic study protocol and made routinely. For example, a periodical estimation of drug utilization for a specific medicinal product, a periodical monitoring of the safety profile of the same medicinal product, or the estimation of the incidence of a series of adverse events, for example, for the same vaccine. Then there are the off-the-shelf studies, which are studies for which a generic protocol is adapted to a research question. And examples are the estimation of the prevalence, incidence, or characteristics of exposure to specific medicinal products, disease epidemiology, for example, estimation of the incidence of health outcomes or description of population or patient characteristics. And then there are the complex studies, which are the more traditional epidemiological studies, if I can say. These are the studies requiring development or customization of specific study designs, protocols, and statistical analysis plan with more extensive data collection and extraction of data. These are the type of etiological studies measuring the strengths and determinants of an association between an exposure and the occurrence of health outcomes. And such study needs to take into account source of bias, potential confounding factors, and effect modifications. And therefore, this is more complex, this is more time consuming, and it requires more expertise. And then there are the very complex studies, which are studies we do not consider possible to rely on simply on electronic SCR database, or these are studies which would require more complex methodological work. For example, studies where it may be necessary to combine diagnosis code with other data, or where it is necessary to validate the code with medical records, or where it requires additional data collection. The next slide. What is the process for the conduct of studies? And we start with the top left corner. The first stage will be the identification question that may impact the committee decision, and this will be through the committees themselves that will know what are the questions that may need to be answered in order to for the decision making, and this may be at the level of the EMA scientific committees or the national competent authorities. This question will then be translated into a research questions, which will need to be evaluated in terms of feasibility. This will be made by the committee and the NCA, but together with EMA. When it is defined, the research question will be communicated to the coordination center that will develop a protocol and programming codes, and will contact the data partners to perform the study. The data partners will receive and run a statistical program to be run on their own database. They will generate results and send the aggregated results to the coordination center. The coordination center will on the side receive, check, analyze the aggregated data and compile the result in a study report. This report will be communicated to the EMA committees or to the requester for the study, and these data will then be integrated within the EU regulatory decision-making process. We can now think about what data source will Darwini EU use. And so this will be a progressive step over time, over a number of years. But in principles, what we would like to have is data source that are collecting health data routinely and that are representative of different types of real-world data in terms of data elements. For example, data from general practitioners or data from specialists or from hospitals, and also from different populations and different settings. We would like to have data sources which collectively provide a broad geographical coverage, therefore covering large number of European countries. Data sources that contain patient-level data with a unique patient identifier linking all records relating to a given patient, keeping in mind that these data will remain locally. And then we would like to have data that may allow studies on the utilization of medicines, and therefore that may provide quantitative information on the use of these medicines. And then we need to have clinical events that are formally coded with accurate dates and linked to individual but unidentifiable patients. And finally, and this will be explained later on, we would like to have data sources that are already converted or that are planned to be converted into a common data model. And next slide will then state who will benefit from Darwini EU. And on the left-hand side of the slide, you see that these are EU medicines regulators, and this will be in the context of drug development, authorization, and post-authorization. And in the next presentation, we will present use cases. But this is not only the EU medicines regulators, these are also the patients and healthcare professionals, European Commission in the context of the European Health Data Space, specifically the national competent authorities, which are not only regulators, but also policy, public health authorities and health technology assessment authorities, and then the EU health agencies and the international health agencies. Academia and research organizations may benefit from increasing use of real-world evidence, from development in methodology or better data quality. And finally, industry will benefit by having access or from the data, have better information on the medicines that they are developing or monitoring or marketing. This will support decision-making, increase use of real-world evidence in marketing authorization submissions, and reduce time and cost of drug development. And I will now give the floor to my colleague, Gian Mario Candore, who will provide a more specific use case and describe the use case for collection of real-world evidence.
So thank you, Xavier. Good morning, everyone. In this presentation, we are going to answer two questions. The first one is why analysis of real-world data that we will have through Darwin is useful for taking decisions in the medicine regulation. And the second one is what type of question can real-world data analysis help to answer? So let's start with the first topic. We have identified 4 categories on why analysis on real-world data generated by Darwin is useful for medicine regulation. The first category is that we can help fill a knowledge gap that the committee might have when they have to take a decision. In particular, we can provide additional information, for instance, on having more recent data, so to check that the status quo, the up-to-date status, has not changed compared to data that were older. Or we can look at additional sensitivity analysis, therefore looking at the same topic from a different perspective, and this will also help to overcome some of the limitations that we have in the data. Third, we can provide evidence from a wider set of databases, and that will help having more confidence on the results provided and on their external validity. The second way in which we can help our committee is about how we run the analysis. Analysis will be transparent and tailored. Transparent because the protocol and the tailored analysis will be made available and will also be done on trusted source of data. Tailored because the requester will be involved so that the analysis will be tailored to answer their needs. A third example is when decision cannot wait. So if we are investigating a potential harm that has a potential public health impact, we need data generated quickly. And using Darwin, we can generate data quicker, and we can avoid the procedural step for imposing and supervising studies sponsored by MAH. For example, is when we have a study that regards multiple substances of the same classes. If we do a study through Darwin, we are able to avoid unnecessary duplication and inefficiency compared to when we ask a study by each of the marketing authorization of the single substances. So now that we have a look at how the analysis can be useful, let's look at what type of question we can answer. And we have worked with our committee to identify what are the real-world evidence need, and we have identified a substantial number of examples that we have categorized in 3 categories. The first category on the left side of the slide is that we can provide evidence to the committee that they can help them to evaluate studies that are proposed by the applicant. A second category in the center, we can provide evidence that help the committee to better understand the clinical context. So evidence on the disease, evidence on how patients with the disease are treated, and evidence on how drugs are used. And then the third category on the right side is we can provide evidence that investigate the association between a medicine and its effect or a regulatory action and its impact. So in the next slide, we're going to see an example for each of them. And this will also be helpful because you can see how this example apply across the product life cycle, from pre-authorization to authorization to post-authorization. So let's start with the first example. Here we can provide evidence that help the committee assessing the design and feasibility of studies that are planned by the applicant. We can provide, for instance, the number of incidence and prevalent patients per year for a particular disease and or for a particular drugs, and see how these patients are distributed in a geographical way. This information can be extremely useful for committee like our pediatric committee when they need to take a decision on whether a study is feasible in a subset of a population, for instance in pediatric or in a subset of the pediatric for a rare disease. And so it will help, this information will help them to take a more informed decision on granting waiver or agreeing on pediatric investigation plan modification. Another example is that we can provide evidence that look at whether the inclusion and exclusion criteria that are planned in a study will make the population that will be studied different from the population that will use the drug in real world. Moving to the second example, so study that has already been completed. Here we can provide evidence that complement the clinical trial submitted. In particular, help us to evaluate the external validity of the clinical trial. As done before, we can check whether the population studied in the clinical trial is representative of the population that will use the drug. So they have similar age distribution, similar gender distribution, similar severity of underlying illness, and so on. But we can also look in case an historical control has been used, whether that historical control is still relevant, so whether the standard of care using that historical control is what is currently used as standard of care. Moving to the second category, understanding the clinical context. Here we have 3 types of use cases. The first one is to better understand the disease. And here we can look at it from 2 different points of view. The first one, we can look at how the disease is prevalent and how it evolves over time. This information is extremely useful for rare disease, where this type of data are rare and not easily accessible. So we have our committee of orphan medicine that could greatly benefit from this type of information, and it will help them to take a more informed decision with recent data from a EU-wide representation, and they will be able to take a more informed decision when they have to decide whether to grant an orphan designation or a maintenance of an orphan designation. We can then also study disease epidemiology to understand how the disease evolved over time, because it's still useful information. The second category is what we call clinical management. Here we identify a group of patients with the disease, and we want to know whether these patients are treated and how they are treated. For instance, are they treated using authorized medicine or off-label medicine? And what is the treatment pattern? So what are the medicine that are used as first line compared to what are the medicine that are used as second or third line? The third category is when we focus on a drug and we want to see how it is used on real world. So we want to see how often it is used, its incidence and prevalence. We want to see for what it is used, its indication, and how it is prescribed, amount and duration of exposure. An example, a real example in this category is when there is a potential, we want to contextualize the risk of a possible contamination with a medicinal product. This happened already in the past, and it was extremely useful for our committee to have an idea on the extent of use of the medicinal product, whether the extent of use has changed over time, so has been increasing or decreasing, who is the population using the product, and in particular, whether there are other medicinal products available that can be used in case we withdraw the specific product with a contamination. Moving to the last category, so association. Here we have the more classical epidemiological study that look at an association between the use of the drug and its effect. And one example that is quite relevant, that is very relevant, was when we used real-world data to study the association between the COVID-19 vaccine and the occurrence of thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome. Here what we did is we initially initiated proactively a study to calculate background incidence rates. These rates that were used to put into context when the first cases of thrombosis event were received, and then they were used to identify the specific type of thrombosis event that we were witnessing. And this analysis was then central to the assessment of the committee of this signal. Moreover, further study have then been done to characterize the type of event that we've been witnessing with this vaccine and what were the potential risk factors that are associated with this event. Finally, we can look at the impact of regulatory action, and here we can look at two things. First, whether the risk minimization measures have been implemented, and second, whether they have been effective. An example in this regard is valproate. Valproate had a risk minimization measure adopted in 2014. However, a study performed a few years afterwards showed how the risk minimization measure was not effective and how the patient were not informed about the potential risk of the drug. And this led to another referral that in 2018 led to strengthening the risk minimization measure for this drug. To conclude, just a few words on Darwin and health crisis. As it was already mentioned in the introduction, Darwin can be a central pillar to plan and respond to health crisis. We have seen how real-world evidence has informed the response to the current pandemic, supporting both the development of medicine, of therapeutic and vaccine, and now that they are available, monitoring their safety and effectiveness on the market. So having an infrastructure as Darwini Eu, with a network of data that is already available, with data that are characterized, a quality framework that is applied to them, governance that is in place, and an analysis that are already planned, will help to have a quick answer that will be helpful to plan and answer to future crises that we might have in the future. And this will be shown even better from Peter Reinbeck and the Coordination Center. Thank you.
So huge thanks to Gian-Mario Candori and also to Xavier Kurtz for introducing Darwini Eu. And just to point out that Gian-Mario's presentation takes a step back from Darwini Eu specifically and is talking about use cases for real-world evidence more generally. Clearly, Darwini Eu is going to be a dominant vehicle for delivering such evidence at European level, but I just want to make the point that there are complementary approaches, including work by member states, including other contracts that the EMA has in place, including on vaccine safety and effectiveness. So thanks very much, gentlemen. So it's a great pleasure now, the main feature of the morning, to introduce the Darwini Eu Coordination Center. And we're joined today by Professor Peter Reinbeck, who will give us that introduction. Over to you, Peter.
Well, thank you very much. And let me start by saying that it's really an honor to be able to give this short presentation about the Darwini Eu Coordination Center. The Department of Medical Informatics at Erasmus has a long history of enabling observational studies and by improving interoperability, but also by building analytical pipelines and applying this expertise now to build Darwin EU together with EMA is really a big opportunity to impact patient care. I'd first like to disclose that this presentation represents the views of the Darwin EU Coordination Center only and cannot be interpreted as reflecting those of the European Medicines Agency or the European Medicines Regulatory Network. Now, the establishment and operation of the Darwin EU Coordination Center will be led by Erasmus MC, and I will be supported by two great deputy directors, Professor Daniel Prieto Alhambra. He's affiliated to both Erasmus MC and Oxford University, and Associate Professor Katja Verhamme, and both have a lot of experience in leading observational studies. And furthermore, we have included subcontractors with complementary expertise from the University of Oxford, Synems managers, IQVIA, the Hive, and Odysseus. And I'm really looking forward to work with this great team, a really passionate team, and the EMA in the next years. Now, setting up Darwin EU is a challenge due to its high expectations with respect to the number of studies of different complexity levels, but also across a large number of databases. But it's also a big opportunity to realize a highly needed paradigm shift for the fast delivery of reliable evidence for regulatory decision making. And I think it's a very important long-term investment to improve public health. And we strongly believe that we cannot meet these goals by simply scaling up traditional approaches. The answer is not in more parallel study teams. We need to really step out of that box. Now, what is then needed to facilitate observational studies at scale? We believe the most important change is to move away from being reactive to study requests and move to being more proactive, apply a proactive approach. And we need to try to deal with challenges upfront, not at the moment we have to deliver fast and reliable evidence. And this means we have to improve interoperability, not at a study-by-study basis, but we should do that earlier. We should not build custom analytics, but have a suite of standardized analytics. And furthermore, of course, we need to have a ready-to-go, efficient and stable technical infrastructure, and it all starts with data. Now, clearly, to increase productivity, we need to apply standardized methods, and customized analytics for each database is simply not scalable and could introduce bias. So also here, we need to be proactive and improve interoperability with respect to the structure of the data and the coding systems through the use of a common data model and standardized vocabularies. But it's still important to realize that a common data model doesn't solve all interoperability issues. We should also develop a repository of cohort definitions for a really large set of conditions, evaluate them upfront, and then reuse them as much as possible. Our goal is to really make studies repeatable, reproducible, replicable, generalizable, and also robust. And a common data model can really help with that. What we will do is we will split up the journey in two steps. So first, the standardization step in which we extract the data from the source and transform it in such a way that we can load this in the CDM, and of course, without losing information. And after that, common analytics can be applied. Now, for Darwin EU, we will use the OMOP Common Data Model, and that is maintained by the Observational Health Data Sciences and Informatics, or OLSC initiative, that's been very, very active in the last years, and is also active with the European chapter. And what's important is that also many tools are available for the data standardization, the data quality, and the data analysis that we can leverage and further improve on. And this OMOP Common Data Model is designed for what's earlier been shared, the federated approach, federated querying and analytics. whereby the applications are run locally by the data partners, and only aggregated results are shared. And this is a kind of privacy by design approach, which is, I think, compliant with data protection requirements. The Open Common Data model has been used in many observational studies, including studies that informed regulatory decision-making. And also important, I think, the CDM is being adopted by many European initiatives and is strongly driven by the European Health Data and Evidence Network project, which is investing 70 million private public funding in standardizing health data to the Open Common Data model through the Innovative Medicines Initiative. And a large number of databases have been transformed already. Now, the transformation of the source data to the OMP CDM, what we call the ETL process, or extraction, transform, and load, is supported by tools to profile the data, to define the transformation step, implement the ETL, and also to perform quality control. And it's important that the ETL is, of course, fully documented. And there's a lot of experience available within the Coordination Center and our partners. Now, quality control is, of course, very important throughout the whole pipeline, but we have multiple tools available to do that. And here you see the data quality dashboard tool that assesses the plausibility, conformance, and completeness of the data by running more than 3,300 checks. And this framework can easily be extended if necessary. So the data custodian can run a tool against their CDM that produces an interactive report that allows to focus on those checks that failed. And it facilitates to deep dive in the problem and could trigger updates in the ETL. In Darwini Eu, we will develop a catalog of open source standardized analytics. And this is needed to support all regulatory decision-making on the utilization, safety, and effectiveness of medicinal products. And of course, this will be a big challenge because it requires that we standardize on the methods, but also on the output that is created. So which tables and which figures are we going to generate? And it will require a really big effort to align on this, but the return of this investment will also, I think, be very high. So for example, we need to standardize the definition of a drug utilization study and only change the drug of interest when we have to execute one. Now, the development will be driven by the proof of concept studies, and we will build on the available tools and methods from the Odyssey community. Of course, we also need to build a strong technical infrastructure, and that requires that we work on building tools like, for example, a study execution platform, a service desk, source control repository, and a Darwin Eu website. Also very important, we will be working on a training platform to help with the change management at the EMA and for other stakeholders. Now, one of the main important tasks, the main task of the Coordination Center is to set up and operate a high-quality data network. And for this network, we will be open to all valuable data in Europe. And for efficiency reasons, we will start with onboarding the data sources our partners have access to, and that will help us to develop and test analytical methods. And we will prioritize data sources that are already converted to the Open Common Data model. But I want to make clear that in parallel, we will be open to data sources that are not yet mapped to the OMP CDM, and we will work out procedures for this, and we will communicate that to the broader community. And an important step throughout in all these different types of data sources is that quality control step. So we will apply quality control measures on all of these data sources, and a process that will be approved by the EMA. Let's have a quick look at the structure of the Coordination Center. It will consist of multiple pillars. One pillar will focus on advisory boards, so a scientific, ethical, and also a data source prioritization committee. And a general assembly will contain all the parties that are involved. And there will be a development track that is really focused on developing procedures, extending analytical tools, do methods research, build dashboards, and build that training material. And on the right side, you see technology. So that's about building the infrastructure, an environment to work together and applying the analytics. And we have, of course, a management pillar, which will have to deal with all the legal and financial aspects and onboarding and contracts within the coordination center. So in the establishment phase, there will be a lot of focus on development and technology and, of course, management and advisory boards. But operations will start playing a more important role very quickly. The development will be phased out, and it will be mainly operations. That's something that we will be working on. Now, for the operations, teams will be created to handle specific studies or different types of studies. And the team will be responsible for the evidence generation and the evidence synthesis together with the data partners. And of course, common analytics will be used and the phenotype library to speed up the process for the cohort definitions. Another important task for operations will be managing the network. And so this team will take care of the quality control, the transformations, the onboarding of the data sources. And of course, this has to be done using common ETL tools and established QC mechanisms. So I hope I explained to you that, or shared with you that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and alignment will be needed first on many of these aspects. But I really look forward to this process with the team and with the EMA. It will be challenging for sure, but also extremely exciting to be part of this. I'll stop there, but if there are any questions directly to the Coordination Center or any good suggestions, please use this email address and we will respond to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. And a very clear presentation on the approach that's going to be taken in the short term, but also in the long term to scale up our ability to deliver high quality real world evidence for decision making. So thanks very much, and don't go away because we have a question and answer session coming shortly. Before we move there to the question and answer session, we have a short presentation from Andrei Sejek, Project Manager for Darwini EU at the European Medicines Agency, on the outlook for 2022. Andrei, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So looking at the next steps on the next slide for 2022 and our implementation roadmap, in which we foresee 5 phases of 12 months each. So there will be 2 establishment phases, starting with this year and next year, before we then move to operations of the network. So this year we've already initiated the work with the Coordination Center on the setup. We will be also looking at performing a data protection impact assessment before any data processing begins. We'll then move on to start recruiting and onboarding the data partners into the network, and in parallel work to pilot with the European Health Data Space model and existing data permit authorities. Of course, we will continue consulting stakeholders, and in the work delivered this phase, we aim to start running the pilot studies to support the EMA committees, therefore delivering the first benefits. In the next phase, next year, still the establishment phase, we will grow the network, add more data partners, perform more studies, and support the majority of EMA committees in their decision-making with reliable real-world evidence throughout the establishment phases. Moving then to the phase 3, the first operation year in 2024, the network will be further upscaled, grown, new data partners will be added, such that it can routinely support the evaluation of scientific committees at the EMA and NCAs by providing and maintaining the network and data studies. Moving to the operation years in 2025 and 2026, the network will then be fully established and operational, evolved yearly with the addition of further data partners and growing the capacity and capability to perform real-world evidence studies. At this stage, we also foresee the integration with the European Health Data Space. On the next slide then, we will continue working with our key stakeholders throughout this year and through the rest of the establishment and operation of the network, including the patients and healthcare professionals, the European Commission, the sister agencies, and other initiatives, including the EHDS and the joint action towards the European Health Data Space. within the European regulatory network, including the EMA committees and NCAs, HMA, and certainly we'll be reaching out to the international regulators. We're already working with the health technology assessment bodies and payers, and we will be working with data holders and partners, the industry and academia and research organizations. We have representation from each of these stakeholder groups in the Darwiniu advisory board, and many of the members we are very delighted to have with us today. The members continue and have supported the implementation of Darwin EU, the alignment with other EU-wide or national initiatives, and the two-way communication and engagement with stakeholders. As I said, we'll continue the consultation and dialogue with stakeholders through public events such as today, through dedicated stakeholder fora and workshops throughout 2022 and beyond. The implementation of the network will also be transparent, including on the processes and on its operations. Next slide, please. So the next immediate steps we'll be looking at over the next weeks and months are focused on the establishment and the formation of the coordination center, setting up the governance, technology operations, and the boards such as the scientific panel. A number of deliverables for the project management will be also completed, such as the project plan, looking at the risk management and reporting lines. Over the longer term period, still this year, we'll be working to strengthen the coordination center, working on the requirements and solution design, establishing a thorough process for the management of conflict of interest, establishing and setting up the scientific panel, change management plan, working on the management plan for the operation and the business plan for the growth of the network. We'll then move on to onboarding the data partners into the network and preparing the groundwork for the performance of scientific studies by working on the templates such that these can be standardized as much as possible. Next slide, please. Once we've completed these steps, we will then move to the actual onboarding and selection of data partners and the conduct of first studies this year. So a wide array of data sources will be considered for inclusion, be that information on use of medicines in primary care, specialist care, hospital data, claims data, disease registries, other dispensing and medicines utilization data. And we will have dedicated work throughout this year on defining the role and the content of patient-reported outcomes in medicines regulation. So once we've got data partners, we will move on to the first pilot studies, which we would like to have across a number of the use cases we have heard about today and across the medicinal product lifecycle. In total, then over the 5 years I told you about, we expect in excess of 380 studies to be conducted. And to conclude my part, for more information, please do follow the EMA website and the Darwin EU webpage on the EMA website. If you'd like to ask us any question, there is a functionality at the bottom of this website, send a question. A dedicated website for the coordination center will be coming in 2022. And just to repeat the email address for the questions to the coordination center. And also drawing attention to the Big Data Highlights newsletter. The first version this year has just been published. And if you'd like to subscribe to it, please contact us via email. This provides regular updates on all the developments in the use of real-world evidence and big data. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andre. Very clear presentation highlighting some of the next steps for 2022. Now, colleagues, we now move on, and we've got half an hour, which I think is brilliant. The speakers have been very disciplined in sticking to the allotted time. That leaves us half an hour for an open discussion. Just to remind you, it's a Slido way of asking questions. So if you use the QR code on the screen or go to slido.com, #DarwinEU. And I remind you again about the data protection rules that were in this data protection statement, which was made available to everyone that registered. I would like to introduce our panel, and can I ask our panel to turn on their cameras? It's a real beauty parade, I can tell you. So colleagues, please, there's Peter Reinbeck proving my point. So I'm pleased to introduce today, in no particular order, the members of the Darwini, representatives of the Darwini EU advisory boards. That's Jesper Kjær, Wim Gooch, Nicholas Hedberg, Katarina Schneider, Marcus Caliola, Elizabeth Vroom, Aldo Pietro Maggioni, Ulva Spooner, and Marilina Vrana, patient representative from the Big Data Steering Group. We have Peter Reinbeck, who's already spoken, Danny Prieta Alhambra, and Katia Vahama, who are the deputy directors of the Coordination Center. And then from EMA, Xavier Kurt, Jamare Kandore, Andre Sedgwick, who've spoken. We're also joined by Sabine Brosch, who is the European Medicines Agency's Data Protection Officer, and Petrula Lisgara, who is one of our expert procurement colleagues. So welcome to you all. I would then open the discussion, and I will kick off with a question for Xavier Kurtz, if I may. It's a process question. Will the reports produced for EMA or the national competent authorities be made public? And how will that work? Xavier, please.
Well, what has been foreseen is that in principle there are very strong measures of transparency, including publication of reports in the EU PASS register. However, we know that there may be some question from the committees that may lead to confidential information or information regarding development of new products. So there will be a need to discriminate this type of research questions from the other ones that may not contain confidential information. So, but in principle, there will be a high level of transparency and publication of reports.
Thanks very much indeed, Xavier, for a clear answer. The next question I've received is, and I'm going to give this to Dani Prieto Alhambra, if I may, just to spread the load. Does every centre have to execute the code manually for every request, or will this be automatically sent back, or will it automatically send back aggregated results? Dani, give us a go.
Yeah, let me maybe answer on how we have been operating until now, and I'm hoping this will improve, of course, during the establishment phase of Darwiniu. So until now, what we have done is sharing analytical code with the data partners who then execute locally and then send back to the PI or the study teams the aggregated results in the form of tables or figures. We will over time improve the way we do this and streamline the process so that it's easier, but the principles are those, basically sharing analytical code in one direction and results in the other, if I can summarize that.
Thanks very much indeed. No, that was clear. The next question that's come in, which is quite interesting actually, collaboration opportunities is the heading, if you like. And I'm going to put it to Peter Reinbeck in just a second. It says, as a private organization dedicated to artificial intelligence and big data processing to help clients tune their pharmacovigilance systems, how can we benefit from or get involved in Darwin? Now, before I give the floor to Peter Reinbeck, I'm going to give an EMA perspective on this. There's huge interest in the European Regulatory Network on artificial intelligence, not just in real-world evidence, but in regulatory processing, clinical trials, pharmacovigilance. And many people on this call will have attended the workshop about 12 months ago on artificial intelligence, where we had some state-of-the-art lectures and really good discussion on this topic. We are developing a reflection paper on artificial intelligence in medicines regulation, and we would foresee some consultation on that reflection paper in the autumn. We're also looking at the feasibility of some hackathon in using artificial intelligence, and we think that's likely to be in the area of pharmacovigilance, but the specific question is yet to be clarified. So I just put that to you as an EMA start, but maybe from a coordination centre perspective, artificial intelligence linked to private organisations working in this space, Peter?
Well, in general, I think these type of companies would benefit extremely from the standardization of the health data by itself, right? So, of course, the data sources that are included in Darwiniu will not be exclusive to Darwiniu. So the fact that a large number of data sources are being standardized would allow others outside of Darwin also to initiate research or ask questions to those data sources. We've been doing that in Odyssey a lot, where we looked at building prediction models and allowing or enabling external validation of these models at a much larger scale than was possible previously. So this could be an interesting area for these companies to get involved in, and I'm happy to provide more details if necessary. Just send an email to us.
Thanks very much indeed. Next question is it's quite an interesting one, and I'm going to spread the question to a number of different colleagues. And so, Wim, Nicholas, Ulva, prepare yourselves. Here's the question. It says, Darwin Data Network is planned with a principal use with medicines regulation, but also what about access and benefits for HTA, for payers, and for industry? So I thought rather than EMA trying to answer that question, let's ask those groups to answer. Maybe I could start with Nicholas, because HTA sometimes comes before paying. Then I'll go to Wim, then I'm going to go to Ulva. So Nicholas, do you want to kick off?
Hello, thank you, Peter, and thank you for the question. I think that potentially there is a huge potential benefit for HTAs in this concept. And we might be interested both on the epidemiological data, the historical data, and the background data on diseases that we heard about earlier in the presentations, and then needless to say about effectiveness data, both I hope during and pre-authorization, but right now we see a tendency to go into a space where we have a very limited number of data on relative effectiveness at first launch, and then it comes the need for post-license evidence generation, and specifically then effectiveness data. Safety data is of course sometimes interesting, but that's more a regulatory business, I would say. So a huge interest in at different stages of the life cycle and introduction phase. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nicholas. Wim, can I hand over to you, please, from a payer perspective?
Yes, thank you, Peter. I just have a lot of overlap with what Nicholas was currently saying. Also, from the payer's perspective, there is a lot of interest, but as you may know, that not all payers are that experienced in using that type of data, and there is sometimes also a little bit caution. So what I hope for to start with is that Darwin provides as a kind of platform to ensure that the data which we use are of good quality and of transparency and consistent. So that is really, I think, something which Darwin could provide and is urgently needed from the perspective of the payers. And then, of course, what type of data? I think Nicholas already indicated that the data on disease epidemiology, but also on how are these treatments actually being used in clinical practice. We know that the situations in RCTs might not always reflect the clinical practice. So are we actually getting to other patients? Do we see the long-term effectiveness which we would expect? Are the same doses used? What about combinations? So I think there are a lot of objectives and goals of the data, but I think prerequisite is that we ensure that they're of good quality, transparent, and consistent.
Thanks very much, Wim. Can I introduce Ulva Spooner? Ulva Spooner is an observer on the Darwin EU Advisory Board representing the pharmaceutical industry. Ulva, I'd be very interested in any perspectives in terms of potential benefits to the industry in particular. Over to you.
Thanks, Peter, for the question. I think industry certainly recognises the huge health and societal benefits of enabling access to broader sets and types of EU data. And we have seen a whole range of examples, some of them which have been referenced today. So increasing capacity to generate evidence to support regulatory and healthcare decision making is something we are hugely supportive of. And then in terms of the access to data, industry's own experience is that R&D right through from discovery, development to outcomes is data dependent. So certainly as data policy and the legislative initiatives that are closely interconnected with Darwin EU evolve, industry would really see as a high priority the importance of exploring how industry might into the future leverage on the infrastructure And of course, Peter mentioned it today, the examples of IMI initiatives where industry has been an active contributor to EU data infrastructure development. So it's a really great milestone to see the appointment of the Coordination Centre now and the EU regulatory network moving forward this. And we look forward to further conversations around how we fully realise the benefits of this really important opportunity for the EU data landscape in Europe.
Thanks very much, Ulva. Maybe I can make a segue because there's a question about, is the patient's voice being heard? And we have two patient representatives, Elizabeth Room, who represents patients on the Darwin EU Advisory Board, and Marilina Vrana, who is on the Big Data Steering Group. Maybe I could give the floor to Elizabeth Room first. Any perspectives or reflections, Elizabeth, from your side?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Also, thank you for the question. Yes, I think if there's one group who has been aiming for more use of real-world data, it might be the patient community. And in this project in Darwin EU, it's not only that, for example, I'm a member of the advisory board, but also that there is really a focus on that ultimately everything should be beneficial to the patient, right? That's what whole EMA is working for. So in Darwin, the data collected are also all meant to be more, develop more effective and safe drugs and speed up procedures. So that is all what is in the benefit of patients and where patients also will advocate for. The other one is like, as you saw in one of the slides, and was mentioned before, that the patient-reported outcomes, which is also often quite close to the heart of patients, there is attention to that. There are discussions, and there will be a workshop in the second quarter of 2022. So I think I see the patient voice is really included in this whole trajectory. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Maybe we can build on that and go to Marilina Vrana, please. Marilina.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, I don't have much to add to what Elizabeth said. Real-world evidence is something that the patient community has been asking for. We feel that with the use of real-world evidence, we will have more timely accessibility to medicines, particularly to groups that are not fully included into clinical trials, like patients with comorbidities or pregnant women, or when some of the medicines might need to be used for pediatric use. That will certainly be of benefit to patients. And yes, being part of the big data steering group for a long time now, I feel the patient voice has been included sufficiently and heard in several occasions, not only within the steering group, but also in all the events that have been hosted so far. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Marilina. And actually just pick up on something that Elizabeth mentioned. It is the intention to hold a detailed discussion on patient experience, patient-reported outcomes later in the year. So watch out for announcements on that, because obviously we'll want to have stakeholder input. Very good. Listen, let's stick with interfaces and touch points. And there's a couple of questions, Marcus. I'm going to put these to you, Marcus Kalliola. So EMA, European Health Data Space Pathfinder, can you detail more this collaboration? Explain relationship between Darwin, European Health Data Space. Marcus, you don't have to have all the answers, but clearly a number of people following the webinar would be interested in understanding the interface there a little bit.
Thanks, Peter. Naturally, the EHDS legal proposal is not out yet, so we haven't seen it yet. We are now in the preparation phase, and I lead the TEDAS project, which prepares for that and provide options for the Commission and the Member States. But definitely the work so far has been close with the IMA, and we've been collaborating, for example, within the data quality aspects, and has been mentioned today, for example, the audits for data sources. So we have that work there in TEDAS. Also, the federated network approach is similar to the Darwin network. And the picture you saw had these data permit authorities. We use a bit different term in TEDAS. We call them designated bodies or something like that, because not all countries at the moment have these data permit authorities yet. And definitely there needs to be a link between the Darwin and the ESDS network. But how all that will function in detail is not yet known for us. But definitely there will be collaboration, and we need to make sure that these two networks work together seamlessly. I hope I wasn't not too cryptic, but I don't know all the answers yet.
No, I think that was very helpful, Marcus. A couple more views from members of the panel. Question here on the input from healthcare professionals and the view about the potential impact on delivery of healthcare. I think it would be a nice question to put to Dr. Maggioni, please. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Peter. I think that to have an initiative that can provide high quality and reliable data is really very, very important for Health Professional Association. As you know, Health Professional Association have the mission to provide recommendation in guidelines or recommendation in general for treating a patient, and to have a real clinical context and real epidemiology that is different generally from the epidemiology of randomized clinical trial or the epidemiology of a specialty registry is really very important, because when you have to give recommendation, you have to have in your hands, in one hand, you have to have the evidence-based medicine, but on the other hand, you have to have what happens in real clinical practice. So this data will be very, very important to provide a recommendation, and also to know more precisely and in the real world the safety profile of the drug that we use currently. We can also help in some way in the methodology of developing studies, and also to provide use cases. That is another way to collaborate.
So thanks very much indeed. Really important to make the interface with the delivery of healthcare and the role of the learned societies and the use cases there. A quick technical question, or combined technical questions to Peter Reinbeck, please. Darwini Eu, will it use the OMOP common data model? I think you've answered that, but also will it use FHIR standards? And there's another complementary question. Will there be other data models beyond OMOP common data model under consideration? I think you touched on this, but maybe you could elaborate a bit, Peter Reinbeck.
Well, in principle, not. As I explained, the need of standardized analytics actually requires a single common data model for us to use. It doesn't mean that it's not possible to use FHIR, and there's quite some activity also in the Odyssey community, together with the FHIR community, where we try to build pipelines from FHIR to OMOP, and there's also some activity on FHIR on top of OMOP for example, for prediction models. So in principle not, but there is expertise available for mapping from FHIR to OMOP. It's actually the approach that we also take at Erasmus Medical Center at the moment, where we have a FHIR endpoint and are mapping the full data source to the OMOP common data model. So because of the need of standardization, that would really complicate it and would not allow us to scale up as much as we want. But I think there's a lot of activity ongoing in the community to help with some of these links that may be interesting to some of the stakeholders here.
Thanks very much indeed, Peter. Interesting question about data sources in member states. And I wonder whether I might put the question to Katharina Schneider from the Data Permit Authority in Germany, and then to Jesper Kjær, who's the co-chair of the Big Data Steering Group, but also heads the Data Analytics Centre in Denmark. The question is, some of the member states have got fewer big data data sources, but lots of registries. How might Darwin embrace these? Maybe start with Katharina. It's a personal opinion, Katerina. You don't have to have all the answers on behalf of Darwin. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. It's actually a very important question that we are currently discussing in the German Health Data Lab as well, because there's just so many different data sources that, yes, would help answer important research questions. And with regard to the German Health Data Lab, the process of answering these questions is still ongoing, as the Health Data Lab is not operational yet. We are planning to be operational sometime this year. But yes, of course, it's a very important aspect, particularly in Germany. We have many different registries that we have started to contact and started the discussion to see whether any collaborations would be possible. Of course, it is important to consider the legislation here as well, data privacy aspects, but yes, in Germany at least, this is an ongoing process.
Thanks very much, Katerina. Can I then give the floor to Jesper? Jesper, my co-chair on the Big Data Steering Group. Registries, that I think the Nordic countries have got one or two of those. Tell us.
Probably a little more than that, to be honest. And yes, some of them are a little bit scattered around, you can argue, and they're very specific down to the level of whether it's the prescription medicines, whether it's actually diagnosis, whether it's specific cancer types. I think all of this effort will actually start us to think across the board rather than think in silos of the different registries. We really need to think about the entire lifespan of the patients, of the citizens in this aspect, right? So I think some of the efforts we do here, which is really a true value in Darwin and European health data space, is to rethink that landscape. Very much looking forward to that.
Thanks very much. I'm going to put one more question that I can see, and it'll be our last question. I would like to put it to Katja Verhamer, the Deputy Director of the Coordination Centre. How do we think Darwini Eu will impact on the speciality of pharmacoepidemiology, study methods and approaches? It's a really nice question. Again, you don't have to have all the answers, but any reflections from your side would be really interesting, Katja.
Yeah, so I think it's going to help and facilitate optimizing the monitoring of safety of drugs and effectiveness of drugs, and I think that's something that we try to have all of us within the community. I think that's really what we are living for and working for each day, and I think setup of Darwin is going to optimize that, and we hope to have the answers on safety and effectiveness in a much faster way, in a good quality way, in a more structured way, proactive, and that's the way I envision this, and that's why I'm so happy to be involved in this project.
Well, what a nice way to end with that answer to that question. Colleagues, to all the speakers, to all the panelists, to all the participants, to everyone that's put a question in, and to everyone following online, Darwini Eu is going to help deliver transition to data-driven medicines regulation. It will, in time, help us deliver better medicines to patients faster and therefore promote public health. We're all working together, we're all pointing in the same direction, and I have very high expectations that we can deliver for public health. So thanks very much to everyone for today. Thanks to the organisers at EMA for the support, both technical and content-wise, and I wish you a very good day. Thank you.